everyone, and welcome to my latest video. And what I wanted to do today for you is to demonstrate how I do a very quick small painting when I'm traveling. Now, we talk about traveling and plein air, and I want to distinguish between the two, because just because I took my pastels on a trip with me doesn't mean that I actually stood out in the lavender field and painted plein air. That's what would be plein air, when you actually stand out in front of the subject and paint it. And while I did that for some of the paintings I didn't. So I'm not a plein air purist, if you will. I like to bring my pastels on a trip, but I'm not always actually painting from life. Sometimes I actually painted from the images on my camera, which when you look at your camera, when you play back your images or your phone, you'll know that they're very small. And so to me, this was just enough information that I could use to paint a little painting, and I would look at the photo just to jog my memory, and then the painting would be mostly done from memory. So it's not technically plein air, but I'm actually painting it. It wasn't from life, but it was immediate. It was an immediate response based upon looking at my photo and saying, oh yes, I remember being in that place today, and now I want to paint it here in the comfort of my home, because it was very hot and it was very buggy, and it was very nice to just sit and relax and paint in the kitchen where it was nice and cool. So I want to show you, I already showed you the supplies I brought. Now I want to show you how I put those to use in a painting. So if you'll just zoom in so we can just see the paper. And this is my box. These are my Giro pastels that I brought. I also brought the small box of new pastels, just a few that I picked out. And then my trusty box of lavender purple pastels, and I'll get to that in just a minute. I'm painting a piece of white Pastelmat paper, and we've been talking this week about Pastelmat paper. It's very smooth, but it takes a lot of layers if you know how to work with it. One thing that I ended up doing is I guess I had a lot of white Pastelmat paper, so I cut it into 5x7 pieces and brought it on the trip. But then when I started to paint, I thought, you know, I don't really want to paint on white paper. That's not going to be very interesting. So I decided I would tone the paper first. And I didn't have a lot of materials with me, so I had to actually be creative. And I want to show you what I did. I'm going to tone this piece of white paper kind of golden ochre-y, and that's because the sand underneath all the lavender. And by the way, I'm working today from can you see this here? Can you see it up here? A very small crumbly photo. This would be like looking on my camera screen or my phone screen. I decided that I wanted to start with a color or toned piece of paper so that when it peeked through, it would not be as distracting as, say, the white paper would be. So I didn't have alcohol with me. I could have used water, but I decided why not use a wet wipe, because a wet wipe actually has alcohol in it. So I took my wet wipe and I simply rubbed in my pastel, and I used a hard pastel for this. I used the new pastel, which is the harder pastel. So I rubbed all this in, and voila, you have a very easily done toned piece of paper. Now I know Pastelmat comes in a lot of, I think someone said 14 different colors. I happen to only have white, so this is a very good way to tone paper when you're on the go and you don't have a lot of supplies. I just use the wet wipe, the baby wipe, and it works perfectly. So it'll dry pretty quickly because it's got alcohol in it. So in the meantime, I'm going to decide what I'm going to do for the painting. Now, if you've been following me, if you've been a Patreon member for a while, you know that it's really important that you make some kind of plan before you start a painting. However, when I'm painting kind of a quick response or a memory painting, which is what I did while I was on this trip, I don't spend a lot of time making a plan. I basically look at the scene, put myself back there, and just kind of respond to it. And you know, sometimes it's okay. It's important to make a plan, but sometimes it's okay to simply just let go and respond to a scene. You know, you're always going to have better results if you take time to make a plan, but again, I didn't. When I did all of the 40 paintings that I did on this trip, I didn't really plan any of them. Alright, so I did an initial drawing with one of the harder pastels. I have the big shapes. I have the mountain shape, there's a green hill, and then there's all this lavender in the foreground. I made this line coming up here because I want to put in the lavender so that it pulls the eye back into the painting. So while I say I don't make a plan, I'm actually thinking about what I'm going to do as I paint it. Yeah. So the next thing I'm going to do is block in the dark shapes. Now there's not a lot of big dark shapes, but I do want to darken the foreground, kind of where the lavender is, where we'll see the very front of the lavender. And there are a few little clumps of trees back along that distant hill side, and those are going to be darker, so I'm going to darken those in. And I'm using a dark blue NuPastel to block in the darks. And notice I've connected my dark shapes so that I don't have little spots of light and dark, which can be distracting. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in the mountain shape so that I know when I do the sky how far down I want to come. And I think I'm going to actually go right ahead to the Giraud pastels, which are a bit softer, and I want to choose a color for the mountains. And it looks like it's kind of a bluish gray-green. So I start with one gray-green, and I look and I say, well, that could be a little bit lighter. So this is a kind of a purpley, grayed down purple, but I really want it to have a little more green in it, so I'll pick another one. Someone asked me, so I'm just going to share it here in case you didn't read it in the comments. Someone asked me, what set of pastels, Giraud pastels, am I using? And I'm using two sets actually that I broke up into pieces, and they are the Richard McKinley selection. So one's his landscape selection and one is his selection called Neutral and Friends. And I really love this set because it has so many wonderful grayed down neutral colors. And as you know, in our month that we studied color, how important it is that we have neutrals so that our bright, intense, pure colors can really come alive. And when I put in that lavender, which is going to be very bright and intense, then hopefully the dull colors that I'm using will actually really pop. So I have my distant mountains. Notice I put a little bit of a blue-gray, and that's to represent the mountain range that's further back. In fact, I could probably lighten it just a tad. So I'm going to add a little bit of a lighter blue on that just to push that mountain back even further. And now it's time for me to paint in the sky. And I like to put in the sky early on in the painting because to me it sets the whole tone and the whole mood of the painting. It tells me what kind of day it is. It tells me, is it a bright sunny day? Is it an overcast day? Is it moody? And I like to be able to know what kind of day it is so that way I can get the rest of the painting to fall in line with the type of day it is, and so that they can talk to one another. We talked about that last month. There are some little clouds in the sky, and I think they're so small I could probably paint the whole sky and then come in and put a little bit of those little puffy clouds because they're small. I'm lightening the horizon. Now notice what I did. I used a cooler blue and a warmer blue, and I kind of mixed them together. And last month we talked about painting skies, and this is what I would call a, what did I call that? I'm having a brain freeze. Fractured sky. That's my fractured sky. And I'm going to put in just a few hints of little puffy clouds using I did actually in this set throw in a very soft pale peach pastel. It's probably a Diane Townsend, because I knew I'd want to use them for my cloud lights. So there's my sky, there's my distant mountains, and now it's time to put in the grasses and the lavender. So before I put in the grasses and the lavender, I want to put in some dirt, because I want there to be something interesting underneath all of the purple. So what goes great with purple? The complement of purple, which is yellow. So I'm going to put in some golden colors underneath, and then I'll put the purple lavender on top. So I'm putting what I'm calling my dirt, so that way it won't just be purple and green, but they'll have something interesting underneath. All right, now I'm going to start at the back. There's a distant hillside. I need this color to be a little bit brighter than the color that is in the distance, because I want it to start to come forward just a little bit. So I'm picking a more intense green. And I think while I'm at it, I really need to add some green to my tree shapes. Remember, I put those in the very beginning, so I need to do something with those right now. I'm going to add some of that green down here for the front of the lavender. Okay, so I'm going to put in some color for the hillside. I think it actually needs to be a little bit lighter than I put it in. Here's a nice light, kind of dull color that kind of helps that hillside go back a little bit. This one in the distance now feels like it should be a little, perhaps a little bluer. So I'm going to add a little lavender to it just to lighten it up and push it back just a little bit more. All right, now comes the fun part. Now I'm going to come in and, well, one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add a little bit of light to the side of the trees. So I'm going to add a kind of a yellowy green, warmer yellow to the right side of the trees to suggest the sunlight. And finally, let's come and have fun with the lavender. And this is where I'm going to use my lavender box. And these are just a selection, of softer pastels that I just threw together. Most of them are Terry Ludwig pastels. I think probably all of them are. They are different shapes just because they've been used. Some have been used more than others. Now remember, the Pastelmat paper is kind of fun to work with, but it doesn't seem to take a lot of layers until you start to get pastel on top. Once you start to kind of build up the pastel layers, then the pastel starts to blend a little bit better. I'm using some cooler, lighter purples to suggest the lavender that's a little bit further back. And then I'm using the warmer, more of a red violet for the lavender that's kind of in the foreground. And I'm using horizontal bands in the distance, and then as I come forward, I'm going to start to change my strokes and make them more up and down. And by the way, I just finished a step-by-step demo of doing some lavender on Canson paper, and I'll be publishing that on our page later this week. So this is not the last lavender demo that you'll see. And basically I'm just going into that purple box that I put together and using those colors to suggest the little bits and pieces of lavender. Now what I need to do is I need to make sure that the eye can move through this field of lavender, and I'm going to do that by changing and adding contrast. So I'm going to press a little bit harder so that you can see some bolder marks, and then I'm going to, let's see, we need a little bit of a bolder mark in here to pull the eye up. And then finally, let's add a lighter mark up against this dark tree, like so. And that area of contrast hopefully will pull the eye. And the last thing I'm going to do is take go back into the harder pastel, and I'm going to go ahead and create some linear marks. And those linear marks will suggest the lavender, so that when the viewer looks at the painting, they can see, okay, those little marks like that, those bushes are little lavender bushes, I can tell. So that way my brain can fill in the rest and say, I get it, that's lavender. And I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of green again, these are little visual cues to help move the eye around the painting. And I do these things last. These are the last marks that I make. They're just the finishing marks. Here's a little bit of more of a red violet so that there's more of a contrast here. And again, just put a few linear marks to suggest the quality or the direction that the lavender is growing. So that is about as much time as I would spend on one of these daily studies or one of these little paintings that I did while I was on my trip. And again, most of them I work from my camera and my memory of being there. So I hope you found it helpful. This has been a great setup for me for travel, and I can't wait to go on another trip and take it with me. So I hope you've enjoyed today's demo.